Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session. Protect your tribal government from common fraud schemes. We're pleased that you joined us today. And before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, we have a couple of great speakers here with us today from Moss Adams. We have Tammy Lohr, Senior Manager, and Ryan Luetkemeyer, Partner. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Tammy to get the presentation started.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really looking forward to sharing some updates on fraud trends in tribal government, as well as strategies to help protect your organization from potential fraudulent activity. Before we get started, we wanted to just do some quick introductions so you know who you're hearing from today. My name is Tammy Lohr. I am a Senior Manager in our Business Consulting Services group. I am a certified fraud examiner, and I help a lot of our government clients set up their fraud programs and whistleblower hotlines to help encourage employees to report potential suspicious activity. I also will help lead investigations into potential fraudulent activity when those are required, and that includes things like looking at transactions as well as internal control weaknesses that may have allowed fraud to occur in that organization. With that, I'll pass it over to Ryan to introduce himself.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm Ryan Luetkemeyer, a partner in our tribal and gaming practice. Excited today to talk about this concept. I've worked with tribes for last 20 years now, helping to address various fraud prevention strategies, helps with audits and doing fraud investigations. And so some of the concepts today, very excited to discuss this with you. Really excited to hear your feedback as well on the Q&A. So please, during the course of this webcast, if you have any questions, we will try to address those live. So please, as much as you can, if there's anything on your mind, this is the next hour to discuss that. And towards the end, we will be talking a bit more about post-pandemic and what we've seen during the course of the pandemic in regards to fraud on a national level. So very excited to talk to you today, and thank you very much for showing up.
Okay, great. Well, this is a little bit about our agenda. So we're going to cover some high-level concepts on fraud, talk about fraud in tribal government, go through some common fraud schemes, and then, as Ryan said, we'll talk about sort of the state of fraud now in our new post-pandemic world. I think we can finally say that, and then talk about some fraud prevention and detection strategies as well. So, without any further ado, let's get started with an introduction into some basic fraud concepts. So I wanted to just start out by talking about what fraud is. So fraud is essentially intentional deception that results in financial or personal gain. And one of the really key things that differentiates fraud from human error is that fraud must be proven as intentional. So that's what separates someone miskeying an error or a zero in a transaction from a deliberate act where they were actually trying to get some funds out of that organization. Fraud, of course, can be committed either internally or externally. When it's committed by employees or members of governing bodies within your organization or internally, it's often referred to as occupational fraud. And that's where someone is using their job or their position for personal gain beyond their earned compensation. Today, our presentation will really focus specifically on some of those internal fraud schemes that are common in tribal government. But of course, fraud can also be committed by external parties like vendors or cyber criminals. We do have a cybersecurity webcast that was recorded earlier this year. If you are interested in how to reduce cybersecurity fraud risks, then I would welcome you to go ahead and look on our webpage and you can find that webcast and learn more about that as well. All right, so here we're going to cover the fraud triangle. And this is the most widely accepted model for explaining why it is that fraud occurs in the first place. So at the very top of that triangle, we have pressure, and this is what motivates the crime. So an employee has some type of financial problem that can't be solved through legitimate means, so they start instead turning to illegal acts. Problems can be personal, like an inability to pay bills, a contentious divorce, drug or gambling addictions, the need for tuition for your kids' education, medical bills, all of those sort of personal financial struggles that may present over the course of someone's life. I'll also mention that professional ambitions can also create potential pressure as well. So we might be wanting to show that we're in a really good financial position to maintain our bond rating, or maybe we want to get the next grant within a specific program, and so we might fudge the data or the elements within our reporting a little bit to make our results look really good, which will then hopefully increase our chance of getting that next grant. At the bottom left corner of the triangle, we have rationalization. Fraudsters often justify their crimes to themselves. So they'll say things like, oh, I was only borrowing the money, I'm entitled to it, I'm underpaid, my employer's cheating me, this money is essentially owed to me. Whenever I think about rationalization, I think about Kronk from The Emperor's New Groove. He's got the little devil on one shoulder, he's got the little angel on one shoulder, the devil saying, do this thing, kill the llama, and the angel's like, no, don't do it. But then the devil starts doing like a one-hand handstand arm push-up type of scenario, and then the angel's like, no, he's got a point. So that's all to say there's rationalization in terms of all people's choices and the way that they think through why it is that they made that choice. And that's my favorite example of rationalization in a Disney movie. The last element of the fraud triangle is opportunity. So the fraudster sees an opportunity to commit the crime. They can abuse their position of trust to solve their problem with a low perceived risk of getting caught. So maybe they have access to blank checks. Maybe there's a lack of segregation of duties for purchasing or creating vendor accounts, or maybe no one's double checking some of the records that they're actually transacting on. There are a lot of ways that opportunity can show up, but at the end of the day, it relates to internal control weaknesses as well as a low perception of detection. And both of those are really key to preventing fraud within your organization. And one of the reasons that we encourage our clients to adopt a formal fraud program is really to increase that perception of detection. So think of it like a cop on the side of the highway. If you're going 70 and the speed limit is 55 and you see a police officer on the side of the highway, you're going to slow down because you don't want to get that ticket. So actively talking about fraud, setting up a program to report and respond to allegations, that's essentially the same type of situation that you're setting up by having that type of program in place. People are less likely to continue speeding on that highway if they know that there's controls and an environment set up where fraud won't be tolerated. Ryan, what would you add to this?
Yeah, that's Tammy, this is a great explanation of the fraud triangle. And I look at this, and I think probably most folks on this call, this is not necessarily a new concept. But I think when in my practice, when I'm looking at folks throughout the country and doing various interviews of personnel and fraud investigations, the bigger issue I have is when somebody comes to me and says, he or she in that position, oh, we trust them 100%. There's nothing, there'll never be anything that they ever do wrong. Right there, that alerts me. It's a red flag to me. And it might sound counterintuitive, but for example, that person, perhaps they've been in this position for a really long time. In that case, I guarantee you, they've identified opportunities where there's weaknesses or there's a likelihood that they could commit or steal money, right? Not that they're going to do it, right? It's just that if in a position that long, I would guarantee that they've seen where the weaknesses are. But then when you start creeping up the fraud triangle, and some things maybe you're not necessarily aware of this person, like externally, maybe they've had some serious health conditions, which has created significant financial difficulties. They have some addiction issues, gambling issues, some kind of, some kind of debt concerns. It's putting a lot of pressure on them, right? It doesn't mean that they're going to commit fraud, but we're kind of going through the whole fraud triangle. And so now when you get to this rationalization perspective, like Tammy just illustrated, I deserve better. I didn't get a raise. I haven't gotten a pay adjustment in a while. When you rationalize it, what happens in the human behavior is it switches from committing fraud or theft into their mind. They're justifying that this is their money, that they deserve this. So it's a weird phenomenon in human behavior where, again, it's not stealing anymore. And so that's why when we talk about people in those positions, again, we might trust them, and I totally understand that, but it does raise a risk. And I just this is such an important concept as we continue to talk about the rest of the concepts in the next hour.
Absolutely, great point. And I know we have some information on those folks that are sort of single contributors or sole contributors in the organization. And there is research suggesting that those people do create a higher risk of fraud. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so now let's transition to talk a little bit more specifically about fraud in tribal government. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners doesn't distinguish tribal government in a separate category during its biannual survey on fraud trends, but we tend to find that tribal government and local government are somewhat similar in terms of size and structure. And so we'll review some of the trends just on this slide that relate to local government. So according to the last ACFE report to the nations, local government experienced about 25% of all occupational fraud in government organizations. That's pretty close to being evenly split, as you can see here, with state and provincial governments. But local governments do have a much higher median loss of $125,000 per instance reported. And a lot of people sort of think, oh, this could never happen in my organization. Everyone is so nice. As Ryan was saying, we have such great employees. They're so reliable. We really trust this person. But fraud absolutely can happen in any organization. And then it has an impact on your tribe, both financially and reputationally. With that, I think we're going to actually have our very first polling question, just to see what you think is the most common fraud scheme in tribal government. So your options here are expense reimbursement. So that's when people submit requests for reimbursement that aren't valid or aren't work-related. Payroll, which is things like creating a ghost employee or falsifying employment records. Corruption, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. Those are things like bribes, conflicts of interest, kickbacks, those types of things. or non-cash, which is stealing or inappropriately using tribal supplies and property. And as you're thinking through these different areas, I'd say just think about your organization, think about the industry, think about the tribal governments that you know, that you work with, and see what do you think would really come to the top as we talk through some of these common trends. Ryan, what have you been seeing with your clients?
Yeah, that's a good point too. When you answer this question, again, the question is more for CPE for this purpose, but I think it's a great opportunity to think about the weaknesses at your place, right, at your organization. Where are those issues where, commonly controls could be bypassed? I like to look at like low-hanging fruit, those high priority areas that we know need to be addressed. Credit cards is a great example. It's an opportunity to bypass procurement. And if you're starting to see a trend in increased credit card transactions, that means, of course, we're bypassing more controls. It might be warranted, but that typically for me, when I see that, it's a low-hanging fruit area because I'm pretty certain I'm going to find something unusual with those credit card transactions. Again, another one, if you have a large construction project, maybe again, not internally, but within the construction project, we see it's a great place for construction managers. We've seen specific examples of buying cell phones for all their employees and charging it to your project, buying vehicles, throwing parties and charging it to the project, fictitious subcontractors that are hired that are fabricated. So there's just, again, if you're thinking through your organization and you're answering this question, think about those particular areas that might be more subjected to risk.
And it looks like a lot of folks agree with you that we have a lot in that expense reimbursement category, about 44%, followed closely by corruption, and then non-cash and payroll rounding us out. So it's very interesting. Okay, great. So before we start talking through the fraud schemes themselves, we wanted to start by outlining the potential profile of a fraudster. So who is typically committing occupational fraud? These are some of the trends that were noted by the ACFE, and we wanted to go over them with you today. So in general, men have committed more fraud than women, about 73% of total fraud cases, and they also caused higher losses than women at about $125,000 per instance versus $100,000, which was by women who were committing fraud. Fraudsters also tend to be pretty highly educated. About 2/3 have a university degree, and we also have found that the more educated you are, the higher losses that fraudster tends to cause. A little over half of fraudsters were middle-aged, so between the ages of 31 to 45, and about the same amount don't have any other workplace conduct issues. It's also very uncommon for them to have any fraud-related criminal backgrounds or fraud-related prior employment issues. So these are people that may be flying under the radar, not really trying to draw a lot of attention. They don't have this in their history. There's no real red flags in terms of their composition. They have a university degree, they're of a certain age, and there's nothing in their background checks that might suggest that they would be committing fraud. The ACFE also does estimate that about 41% of occupational frauds are not reported to law enforcement. So the number of repeat offenders is probably much higher than what we're able to determine in this research. A lot of organizations won't report confirmed fraud to law enforcement. They'll just terminate that employee in order to try to protect their reputation. In keeping with our profile of a fraudster, this slide shows the position of who committed fraud by the frequency, the median loss, and how long it took to detect that fraud was occurring. So as you can see here, most fraud happened at that employee or manager level, but you'll notice that the time required to detect that fraud nearly doubled between the employee and the manager level. And then the median loss more than doubled at the manager to employee level. When we get to that executive level, we have significantly higher median losses with only a slightly significantly longer time to detect that fraud was occurring over managers. And here we're showing you the top 5 concealment methods used by fraudsters. These are things to look out for as common ways that fraud is committed. Essentially, these 5 different areas are all iterations on the same type of activity, which is manipulation of documents to try and cover up fraudulent related activity. So it's altering, falsifying, destroying documents, whether those are physical or electronic, to ultimately conceal that fraud. And this is one of my favorite slides. So here we're going to show you the most common warning signs of fraud based on employees' behavior. The ACFE reports that 85% of all fraudsters displayed at least one of these red flags. So the 8 most common red flags are listed here. We have 39% of fraudsters that were living beyond their means. So think about things like, did someone just get a new Porsche? Did they take their entire extended family to Disneyland? Did they do that 3 or 4 times this year? Does that make sense for them? Disneyland's a pretty expensive place to vacation, especially if you're not in the Southern California area. So thinking through some of those things, there's actually an entire body of work around Disneyland as actually a risk. Too many trips to Disneyland is a risk of potential fraud, depending on the organization and other factors, of course. You have to think about the context of your employees rather than just questioning them on their new car or anything like that. 25% of fraudsters had financial difficulties. We talked about these in that pressure component of the fraud triangle. So things like addictions, family troubles, medical bills, children going off to college for the first year, those types of things. 20% of fraudsters had an unusually close relationship with a vendor or a customer. So do you see people out on a contractor's yacht? Do you see someone involved in purchasing, out to dinner with folks or attending galas or other fundraising activities? And who are they really connecting with while they're there? The last area here on the top line is sort of what Ryan was talking about, is those excessive control issues, the unwillingness to be able to delegate tasks to others. So again, we're thinking about only one person really knows how to do this activity. Only one person knows how to reconcile these accounts. Only one person knows how to create a new employee account, create a new vendor account, and thinking through the potential risk. Maybe we really trust that person, but there is both a risk because they could win the lottery and then they're not working at your organization anymore, and no one else knows now how to do that. But a lot of times frauds have been detected by people who were sole contributors going on vacation, going out of the office, and then someone else had to take over that work and realize that something was amiss. On the bottom row, we have about 10 to 12% of fraudsters displaying these behaviors. So we've got, irritability, suspiciousness, defensiveness, bullying, intimidation, divorce or family problems. And this is an actual quote from the ACFE, a general wheeler-dealer attitude. So someone that's always trying to cut a deal and sort of see what's in it for them, thinking about that first and foremost. And this really sums up some of the general things to think about and consider to help support fraud prevention in your organization. Okay, so at last, we're going to start talking about some of the common fraud schemes that do occur in tribal governments. We're going to cover 3 of them with you today. So first up, we have corruption. And corruption is the wrongful use of influence of your position in order to get some type of personal gain. This takes a lot of different forms, but it often involves things like bribery, kickbacks, gifts, extortion, or conflicts of interest. These schemes are pretty notoriously difficult to detect because there's not always a clear paper trail that exists within your organization on what actually occurred. And for that reason, corruption schemes are unfortunately pretty common as well. To help avoid corruption, it's really important to make sure that ethics and integrity are upheld and promoted by everyone that represents tribal leadership. So really thinking through that tone at the top in your organization. How do we support those ethical practices through training, through code of conduct, through some personnel policies to create really clear expectations on our culture and what is or is not tolerated in our organization to help prevent this. Other ways to help avoid corruption schemes are things like having really strong hiring and screening processes, as well as internal controls, especially segregation of duties in a lot of the transactions that involve high dollar amounts. Often corruption schemes, when they are able to be detected, are done so through things like whistleblower hotlines, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and I know Ryan will cover later on in today's presentation. Audits, and then monitoring and data analytics, where you're looking for unusual transactions or volumes in what was above and beyond a normal transaction or volume for a specific activity. The next area that we're going to talk about are billing schemes. So these schemes are both pretty common and pretty costly. They are usually used to help generate cash for an employee, but they can also be used to help get goods or services for an employee's personal use. In a billing scheme, a perpetrator creates falsified support for a fraudulent purchase, like an invoice, a purchase order, or a receiving report. And billing schemes can take a few different forms. So a couple of examples are that someone may purchase, someone in facilities purchases a lot of drywall for the organization. They end up taking a lot of that drywall home in order to have their own home remodel, or maybe they're doing a contracted remodel for another organization. So that's billing scheme in order to get goods and services that aren't that they didn't purchase themselves. Another example that's pretty common is when an employee creates a shell company. So they create a company, they input that company into their system as a vendor. They start creating fake purchase orders and invoices for goods or services rendered that may or may not have actually occurred. They're cutting checks from their organization, putting that over to the shell company, paying that shell company, draining the shell company's bank account, and actually paying themselves. So that's the sort of classic billing scheme that we usually see. The fraudster can also make a personal purchase and then end up billing it to their organization. That's pretty common on credit cards. So that's where Ryan was talking about the use of credit cards to sort of circumvent procurement practices. And is that appropriate? And how do we know that everything that was purchased on the credit card is really used for the purpose of the tribe? That we don't have someone going to Home Depot because they have an urgent need. They're purchasing something, but they're also maybe getting a couple of tools for their home garage. And so those are another example of a potential billing scheme, which is really close to an expense reimbursement scheme, but sort of the concepts are very similar here. Because of the way that these schemes work, they do create an audit trail, although it can sometimes be hard to tell which invoices or transactions might be fraudulent. So to help prevent this scheme, it's important to have really strong internal controls, segregation of duties during the vendor setup process, during purchasing processes, thinking through the credit card reconciliation processes and approvals in order to mitigate the risk of your organization having this type of scheme. Usually these are detected by looking for unusual pays, having additional approvals or reports for new vendors, again, looking through what is a normal transaction level for a certain area and being able to identify when we're above and beyond that amount. And then, of course, audits and site visits for vendors has become a more popular way to try to identify these schemes as well. Okay, and the last fraud scheme that I'm going to cover today is payroll fraud. So in a payroll fraud scheme, an employee essentially manipulates employee records to get more compensation than what is owed to them. So in some cases, an employee may claim overtime for hours that they didn't actually work, which of course results in a higher payment than what they are actually due. In other cases, someone may create a ghost employee. So they're creating an employee within the payroll system who doesn't actually work at that organization. This newly created employee is then paid, and the fraudster is actually the person that's collecting that check and receiving this non-employee's compensation and paycheck. To help avoid things like this from happening, it's again important to come back to your internal control environment, look for those internal control weaknesses, Think about the segregation of duties within your payroll processes, who's setting up an employee, who's reviewing their timesheets, who's inputting their pay rates, and then how are checks actually being issued. So thinking through that full process to make sure that there's not one person with control over every piece of the transaction, and that we have those good segregation of duties and approvals well documented. There are also potential IT solutions that may help flag unusual timesheet activities for additional review before you actually process payroll, which is a great avoidance technique as well. These payroll schemes are usually detected, again, through those whistleblower hotlines, through payroll audits, and then making sure that we have that documentation and the appropriate level of oversight over our employee compensation as well. With that, I'm going to pass it to Ryan to talk more about the trends in the post-pandemic world that we are all officially living in.
Thanks, Tammy. Yeah, I think I do want to cover this topic. It's almost like a new reality is the way I'm looking at it, especially in the financial world. We had this time period during the course of the pandemic where COVID-related funding from the federal government exceeded $5 trillion. And during the course of the pandemic, it's led to some of the largest frauds in U.S. history. And I don't think that that's a surprise. I mean, you probably hear about it often on the news, but we're going to dive into a little bit more about how that impacted state and local governments and tribes. So thinking through that, and we'll get into this, but think about that time period and how unusual that was, right? Where processes were changed and altered. There was social distancing, the need to work at home, to move employees home to stay away from the office. But then you had all this funding coming in, right? So thinking about that, and then also taking into consideration the fact that the lack of budgeting, the staffing shortages that occurred, more sophisticated type criminals using technology, cybersecurity concerns, identity theft. We talk about inflation, price gouging, et cetera, right? There was so much going on during that time period. And then when you go back to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners 2022 report, where, Tammy highlighted some of those items there, right? Even before the pandemic, governments suffered the second highest median loss due to fraud compared to all other industries globally. So it was already a problem with governments, but then you add on this with all these staffing shortages, et cetera, and all this increased funding, it's created a ripe environment for abuse. And in doing various surveys with tribal officials, there is no question that the prevalence of fraud, waste, and abuse will likely increase in future years. So let's talk a bit more about that, specifically with the money coming in regarding the pandemic, which was extremely unusual, right? Because in this particular case, think about the coronavirus relief funds that started under the CARES Act. We even have more with the American Rescue Plan as well. Significant money came in, was provided to you to address the pandemic, this essential emergency. But the money came in first, but the rules and regulations came in afterwards. And in some cases, the rules and regulations conflicted with each other after weeks of getting FAQs, et cetera. So it was a very unusual situation when maybe you only have a few of your employees in the office able to process and determine how to use this funding and to get together and identify what's going to be the best use for tribal members. So thinking through that timeline, just kind of covering this a bit for that 2020 time period, hopefully you can follow along with this timeline, but I don't think there's any question that we all know what happened at the beginning of 2020. But right after that, you had the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. You had the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Act, providing funding and various opportunities for governments. Of course, in March and April, you had over $2.6 trillion provided through CARES Act and PPP enhancement. But not even a month after that was finalized, in May, you had your first charges for individuals defrauding the PPP program. We'll cover a little bit of that. I know a lot of tribal business entities and governments were able to receive PPP loans, but in a lot of cases, these loans, again, there's no question that in the news you've probably heard about it, right? There's just a very abused program, if I were to say. But then after we kind of continue on through the rest of 2020, we had the economic relief bill that was issued at the end of 2020. And then starting at the beginning of 2021 is when we had the American Rescue Plan provided. And then right after that, it was blatantly obvious through all the various Office of Inspector Generals that there needed to be some type of additional oversight in regards to the amount of abuse occurring with these various programs. And so in May of that year, the COVID-19 Fraud Enforcement Task Force was established, which provided a bit more of insight as to what actually was going on in these various programs. So when thinking through the pandemic-related fraud, it's estimated that fraudsters potentially stole more than $280 billion in this COVID relief funding. And then another $123 billion was either wasted or just simply misspent. So we're talking roughly right now, just based on estimates, about 10% of total funding. Who knows how far above that it could possibly go? Clearly, it's above that 5% that Tammy spoke about. That is very common with each year with the ACFE report that's issued. 5% generally of your revenues is lost due to fraud, and that is a pretty decent target on average. So if you're thinking through your organization and maybe you have weaker controls than what would be expected, that 5% obviously is going to be higher than that for you. But in this case, it was extreme. The Department of Treasury is leading various coronavirus relief fund desk reviews. And you can see on the source at the bottom, if you go to that website there, you'll see all the various reports that have been issued in regards to their desk reviews. And right now, it's approximately $2 billion in question costs just from the CRF program that have been primarily unsupported expenditures incurred during the initial stages of the pandemic. Now, unsupported costs, maybe not all that is necessarily fraud, but it's indicative of potential, of course, non-compliance. But likely it's, in most cases, it's abused uses of the funding as well. And with just a very common example that I've seen, and this one's a specific example from one of these reports, but you had an authorized employee approve over $1 million of the CRF monies to reimburse COVID-related expenditures. But then they conspired with others to commit fraud through the submission of fraudulent invoices for goods or services that were just simply never provided. Again, this was a very common issue. Going back to that fraud triangle, those opportunities, pressures, and rationalizations, when I say this is very common, it is, because this is very much what we typically see. It's just finding ways to inappropriately use that substantial funding that was provided to governments during the course of the pandemic. PPP loans, some highlights there too from the various reports that have been issued. Summarizing, about $800 billion was authorized for PPP loans. It's estimated that about 10% or $80 billion of that was lost to fraud. The inspector generals have estimated that there's approximately 70,000 loans that are potentially fraudulent, but we're just simply never going to know the amount of additional loans that were provided to businesses in which the businesses simply just didn't need that money to survive during the course of the pandemic. So again, very, very much an important highlight, especially when you talk about this last bullet on this example, which again, very, very common. You had an individual apply for 15 different PPP loans to 8 different lenders using 11 different companies. They applied for about $25 million in PPP loans, and they obtained funding of about $17 million and just used it for whatever they felt necessary during the course of that time. You'll see homes, jewelry, luxury services, and vehicles, etc. So just the program, if you did apply for it, you probably note that it was rather unusually easy to obtain that funding and justify. And in a lot of cases, those applications, in many cases, like we just indicated, were just fraudulently prepared. So just an unfortunate situation there. But let's go to this next polling question. Again, we need to answer at least 75% of these to get CPE credit. So during the course of the pandemic, did internal controls and processes significantly change at your organization that were likely increasing the risk of fraud? It's quite simply yes, A, no, B, or if you're not certain, you could put I don't know as well. But I'd love to hear or I'd love to see the responses to this. I assume it's going to be overwhelmingly yes. We conduct our reviews nationwide, and we've definitely from our interviews have seen this has been pretty much consistently a big concern during the pandemic. So give you a couple.
Yeah, I think a lot of our clients had manual processes that they were using pre-pandemic, and then they suddenly had to figure out, okay, we're all working from home, so now how do we have those same types of controls, processes? How are we documenting approvals? And a lot of use of email is what we've certainly seen with some of our clients.
Yeah. Well, that was surprising. So no, I would love to hear. So it looks like in most cases with the folks here on this call, 35% said no, that during the course of the pandemic, internal controls and processes didn't significantly change or increase the risk of fraud. So it's kind of split evenly throughout these various answers. I'm going to talk here, moving on, I'm going to talk about some of the safeguards that were bypassed. And maybe that'll bring up a conversation and maybe address some questions of yours. But, I think when I look at what happened during the pandemic, those organizations where they had adequate technology, adequate staffing, et cetera, they were definitely more able to adapt to the circumstances of stay at home, work from home, social distancing, et cetera, but not everybody. So we'll talk a little bit more about my thought process with what we see nationwide here. All right. So with the CARES Act, the CARES Act was really more of an emergency nature. Very, very unusual to see this, but as a result of having legislation like this that was provided for emergency nature, the CARES Act did not require all elements of the uniform guidance. And we'll talk a little bit about what was not necessarily required, but in this case, that provided a very unusual predicament for a lot of tribal organizations and governments, because that was kind of the theme. For example, the procurement requirements within uniform guidance were not required to be followed. That makes sense, right? Because generally the procurement process, going out to competitive bidding, kind of slows down the process. And the goal of this money was to hurry up and distribute it to provide safety to membership and to your folks. But subsequently, like for example, with the American Rescue Plan, it was not emergency nature. And if you'll recall the rules that came out after ARPA, the final rule, over 500 pages of materials, there were a lot of restrictions on utilizing ARPA. But there was a lot of confusion because a lot of tribes believed, okay, well, ARPA is kind of following the same theme of CARES Act. So nationwide, there has been a significant number or spike of findings related to noncompliance with ARPA because of that. And it's the kind of the situation now as we see it, thinking through this post-pandemic future, it's necessary at this point to get back to a strict enforcement of your own policies regarding procurement, et cetera, and also to those uniform guidance requirements, because those aren't going away, right? We need to get back to that. So the typical requirements or the policies that were bypassed, like I just mentioned, we did see a lot of a significant reliance on sole sourcing of contracts. Um, Generally, a competitive bidding process is very helpful to avoid working with folks that maybe we have a friendship with, or their family members, or there's some other reason. So there's a huge benefit in going through a competitive bidding process, not just for cost savings, but a lot of other controls in there. But when you're relying a lot on sole sourcing, it does kind of kick us back into gear of like, oh, I trust this contractor. I worked with them before. I'm going to continue to use them. But we don't know if they potentially would have been the best for that particular project. We just, in our gut feel like, oh yeah, we've worked with them before or know them, so they're going to help us out. You can clearly see that sole sourcing does increase the risk that you could potentially have people utilizing that money and conspiring to commit fraud. So just kind of moving on, we did see, and because findings through single audits are published, we have seen a very big spike in the fact that approvals were not there, processes weren't followed. There was significant results of lack of supporting documentation to support costs. But the last bullet here, which has been the most surprising that I've seen during the course of the pandemic and moving forward, is just this siloed culture between finance team and operations staff or program staff. This, I almost look at it as animosity. It's been much more difficult to see finance and operations team working together to combat the pandemic. And in some cases, we still continue to see that. And I like to talk about that because there's nothing better to an organization than making sure everybody is on the same page, right? I know we all hate to do meetings all the time, but the more opportunities that you can have your operations programs team meet with finance, even to hash out problems or to talk about uncomfortable situations, it is simply better for the organization as a whole. And so for me, when I go do a fraud investigation or an audit, and I see this siloed culture, it raises there's red flags there. It's a concern because things might not be operating like the way they should. But we've definitely seen that happen as well. I'm going to run through these. A couple more things here. I think we've talked a little bit more about this, but there's definitely been this increase in findings, and the fact that we've seen this increase, this spike in findings and non-compliance, it has such a detrimental impact to future funding, future opportunities, increased costs for audits, because if you're a high-risk organization, that means you're more susceptible to risk. Auditors are required to test more. It'll cost more during the course of your audit process. But then also it really debilitates your ability to obtain competitive grants or to be competitive there. So like that's a big concern that should be avoided here moving forward. But again, we can't ignore the fact that staffing shortages did contribute to this as well. Just this really summarizes a little bit of what we've already talked about, but this reduction of meetings between teams, increased complaints and arguments, the staffing shortages, increasing workloads, and again, lack of willing to work as a team is definitely been a highlight of the theme that we've seen with post-COVID. And covering staffing shortages a bit more, let's look at the issues over here on the left-hand side of your screen. All right, you're seeing significant turnover. You have vacant key management positions. What does that lead to? It's clear, right? Burnout of your current staffing. It erodes your established internal controls and safeguards. Clearly, all that increases the risk of fraud and abuse, right? So that there is clearly a risk in relation to that. It's not just simply we need people to do stuff. It's actually having a detrimental impact to potential compliance matters as well. With tribes too, a lot more of a traditional cultural hiring process. Most tribes nationwide want to see people in the office working 8 to 5, right? So let's look at this issue. Let's say you have open positions and maybe you're publicizing that open position in your local newspaper. Well, right now in this highly competitive labor market to find talent, you are already, if that's simply all you're doing to look for new, to fill your open positions, that's not going to cut it. You need to be creative and innovative in finding opportunities, maybe even expanding geographically, to find ways of bringing people, showing them the opportunity to work with your organization. That kind of moving to this third issue, I'll highlight this as well, but if you're not open to outsourcing or remote options, giving your employees opportunities to work from home, if you don't have a sophisticated IT system to be able to accompany that, you are already in a very bad position to be competitive in finding new talent. So my advice with most tribes is, the traditional approach that we've had with this 8-to-5 mentality really needs to change. You need to find ways of offering better benefits packages, supporting and paying for moving costs to have new employees come to work with you. Need to find ways to be competitive again in this highly competitive market. I like to look at everything on a spectrum here. So when I look at the eroding of fundamental accounting processes, I don't think there's any question here. On the green side, we want to see this strong tone at the top, consistent monthly closing, up-to-date policies. Those are all signs of a great organization. But as you move down that spectrum, and the organizations in red that are not doing so well will have the exact opposite of what we just talked about in the green, right? But this constant fire drills, if you're in an organization where you're consistently needing things processed, checks processed at the last minute, the impact to your employees when that occurs is substantial. The impact to your controls, the impact to potential accidents or errors is significant. And so what I recommend everybody, when you're looking at how your system is operating, the more you can get to the green, more you can ensure that you have a consistent monthly closing process to simply address budget variances during the course of the year, as opposed to the end of the year when everything is over with, the more in a much better position you're going to be. So just summarizing all of that, this fraud risk assessment, you've probably, as we've talked through these matters the last hour, you've probably in your mind have already kind of evaluated this if you're thinking about your organizations and the increased rise of risk, the increased risk of fraud. So if you have these issues where, incentives, pressures, opportunities, risk of internal control override, information technology risks, maybe your system isn't adapted properly, and you need to think about all this organization-wide to see where are your high priority risk areas. And this particular heat map here is an example. It's a little more focused on one tribal government, but you can clearly see that in the red is where this particular entity saw its most vulnerable concerns. And this is extremely very common in tribal organizations. You'll see at the very top right, improper IT security access. I've had a recent example where there was a payroll clerk that we were working with, and she had access to manually update PTO hours for her and for all employees. So she was manually overriding her hours and her friends' hours without any problem at all. And those type of issues, if you do have, and maybe you're not even aware of, those particular issues leave you extremely vulnerable. So think through this. When you do your fraud risk assessment or hire a firm to help you with this, think through this, visualize it, have everybody have a stake in evaluating overwhelmingly or over the organization as a whole to see where your risks are. So kind of going back to the report from the ACFE, please ignore the percentages here. There was an error in this last slide. Sorry about that. But just focus on the particular areas here. Number one, anti-fraud control is some sort of hotline. Now, a hotline is going to be, what we call a detective control. It's kind of like after the fact kind of fraud issue. We look at preventative controls to make sure the fraud doesn't occur at all, but sometimes we need those detective controls, and the hotline is the best form of that, followed by fraud training, some type of anti-fraud policy. And then again, these formal risk assessments, we've seen definitely an increase, and so has the ACFE report as well. And speaking, well, let's get to this next question here. My tribal organization has a hotline where employees can report suspected fraud, waste, or abuse. True, false, or I don't know? I'll give you a few minutes. I know we have just a couple more slides that I want to highlight here, talking about safeguards and improvement, but we need to answer this again to get CPE credit. And we'll have one more here in a couple of minutes. That'll be our final question. All right. I would expect that most tribal organizations have a hotline, and I love to see this. I'm a little surprised about the I don't know. I'll talk about that. So let's move on to it. We'll talk about the I don't knows. So here, the report really highlights what were the best detective controls, what they found actually identified the particular fraud in that report. And overwhelmingly, you can see that there was some type of tip that identified the fraud. And in most cases, it was an employee, which we would expect. But you can also see customers and vendors were also part of the process too. So your tip hotline hopefully should be opened up to not just employees, but your customers and vendors as well. But as you go down this line, you'll see that external audit is way down the list. Your external audit is not designed to identify fraud, all types of fraud. You can see by overwhelmingly, fraud is found more often by accident than by external audits. So it's important to see that. It's also important to see that fraud is found significantly more quicker than with a hotline than without a hotline. So much benefit in making sure that that is occurring. Now, going back to the polling question and seeing the results, well, actually, I'll get back to that. The employee training. Employee training on fraud is substantial, and it's in part of the results here too. Training increases the likelihood that you will have the fraud detected by some type of tip. In 45% of the cases that occurred with training versus without training was only 37%. So there is a bit of a rise there, right? And with training, you're more likely to see fraud cases that are provided through the hotlines than without. So trainings like this, glad you guys are all on board. We'll increase those stats for the positive, okay? Highlighting, these are common, but I can't ignore this. What are the 8 best practices? Strong tone at the top. Really, leadership. If there is any fraud that occurs, and you're just slapping the hand on the wrist of that person, that is overwhelming bad communication organization-wide. Employees see that, and it brings a significant rise to potential fraud in the future. Segregating duties. Again, having that hotline. Important best practices. I combine 4 and 5, rotating people, requiring mandatory vacations. The fact that you have that employee that might have been there 20 years, if you have a requirement that they take vacations or they are rotated out, not only does that help in cross-training, but potentially that shifting of the tasks for a bit, that other person might uncover some suspicious activity that had been occurring. So very important, as well as that reconciliation and review process that we want to see at least monthly. And finally, combining 7 and 8, we talked about the accounting system access, just making sure that those are appropriately assigned. Okay. So just again, I went through that really quick, but the last question we have: will one of these best practices need to be implemented at your tribal organization? If you click A, that means no. Our internal controls are already strong. We don't need to do anything more. B, at least one of these best practices that you're going to think about needing to emphasize? Or maybe C, maybe it's more than one. I would expect that maybe there's going to be some improvement that's necessary. So I would expect the results of this will be strongly in favor of at least B or C. All right. We'll give a few more. There's only 48% of the attendees that have, and this is the last slide we have. But while we're waiting, there's a few more folks that need to answer this question. Going back to the hotline, again, the training, the training specifically, this is a good training for stuff, but training your employees about how to use the hotline is extremely valuable. And so in this case, 41%, at least one of those safeguards need to be improved. So thank you for all. I think that's all I have here. Anything else, Amy, that we might have missed?
No, that was it. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you, Tammy and Ryan, for a really great presentation today. And then to our audience, if you have further questions or comments, please reach out to us and we would be happy to continue this conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Tammy and Ryan directly. Their contact information is in your console as well as in the slide deck, which you can download now from the handouts window. And if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks if you can't download it now. And then finally, here is a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is appreciated, and thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.